Network Dojo.
Now we've talked about how to pick which controller we want to join through the different join preferences. But once I say I want to join controller 2, I might have the ability to join it via v4 or the ability to join it via IPv6. And how do I choose which one of those transport methods to choose if they're both available to me? So when the AP and the controller both have v4 and v6 addressing enabled, so on the controller, that'd be the management interface, has both v4, v6, and it's the AP manager. And the AP has both v4, v6 addresses learned. When we discover that controller is going to teach my AP both v4 and v6 AP manager interfaces. And so my AP then has a decision. Which method do I use for my transport once I have the option here? Now, there is a preference that we can configure both on the controller as well as on the AP, and they both have a bearing, but at the end of the day, the controller preference really is the one that matters. So on the AP side, by default, it has actually no preference, which is weird because no preference actually just means IPv4, so why didn't they just make it IPv4? I don't know. But so by default, the AP will prefer to join via IPv4. The controller's default preference is definitely explicitly IPv4, and so by default I guess they're matching up, which is good. Now we can change the controller's preference, and we can set it either at a global level, which is the normal way you would do it, or we can override that global level on a per AP basis, AP group basis. So I can configure an AP group that has an explicit preference in the AP group, and any APs that are a part of that group would get that preference. AP groups do not have to have an explicit preference. They can just use what the global setting is. That's fine too, but that's the only way to override the global setting is on a per AP group basis. And yes, we can actually configure it on an AP basis, the AP's preference, but we're going to find out that it's completely or almost completely irrelevant. Now, assuming there aren't any issues joining the controller, here's the general flow of, do we do v4, v6, and how is this all going to flesh out based off of the AP's preference versus the controller's preference. So, starting off the bat, the AP is going to discover the controller, and then it's going to attempt to join the controller using the AP's preference. And so, by default that's v4, but if the AP had a preference of IPv6, it would try to join over IPv6. So the AP will join using its preferred mode. Once the AP joins, as long as this is a successful join, the last part of a join process is the controller pushes down new config to the AP. Part of that config push is the preference that the AP should use. And so whatever the AP's preference was, once it joins, the controller will force its preference down to the AP. Now, if that preference is the same, so let's say the AP joined via v4 and the controller's preference was v4, so it didn't change, and so as long as we join via v4, the AP stays up and it works just fine. But if the controller's config push changes the preference of the AP, what will happen is the AP will disassociate, reassociate using the new preference, and at that point it should be able to stay up because the AP is joining according to the controller's preferred mode. So let's say that the AP was pre-configured to prefer IPv6. The controller is set to prefer IPv4. The AP will join initially over IPv6 because that's the AP's preference. Once the join completes, the config push happens. The AP's preference will change from v6 to v4 as a part of the config push. After that, it disassociates. Now it's going to associate again with its new preference, which is v4. That matches up with the controller, and that time it stays up via v4. And so it'll either join once if it had the same preference, or it'll join, disassociate, and switch over to the controller's preference. So at the end of the day, the controller enforces its will, and it will alter the AP's preference to match what it is using. And this assumes that there's no problems actually joining the controller. So what was, there's different possibilities you can run into when you start running into failures. So let's say that the The AP preferred v6, it joined via v6. The controller preferred v4. Okay, the AP disassociates, tries to join via v4, but that fails for whatever reason. It'll go back to v6. Or maybe it preferred v6, and so it tried v6, but that failed. And then if it tries via the preferred mode, but that fails, it'll actually try the non-preferred mode on the same controller. But if both methods fail, you know, the v6 and the v4 both fail, at that point it says, okay, I can't get on this controller, I'm going to move to the next controller in my list. And if you look at documentation about this, there's this big old flow chart that talks about all the different rabbit trails you can kind of fall down. But we're just going to assume that, you know, we're not going to run into a problem in the lab once we get things configured the way we want with a join. So the joins will work. We're just going to have to configure the preferences as requested, and we're just going to assume that the joins are work. So this is really the flow that you need to understand. You don't necessarily have to worry too much about what happens during different failure type scenarios. It's an interesting exercise, and it's good to know for real life. But at the end of the day in the lab, it's not quite that important. Now, you might think that there's no other option than, you know, the controller enforcing its will, but we can actually override that. There's a couple of ways to get around it. One real sort of heavy-handed way of doing it is say, you know, if I want let's say the controller prefers IPv4, I want my AP to join via IPv6. Well, I could prevent my AP from ever communicating via IPv4 to the controller. And so maybe I go so far as to never even teach it an IPv4 address, or maybe I use like an ACL to block it. That's a little bit over the top, probably. If they want to go against the grain, usually probably what they'll want you to do is actually, if you configure a static IP address on the AP will use that transport type every time. And so if you configure a static IPv4 address, it will always join over IPv4. If you give it a static IPv6 address, it'll always join over IPv6. It doesn't matter what the controller's preference is at that point. So usually we use static IPs to control, okay, you join via v6, or you join via v4 if that goes against the grain of what the controller generally wants. But more often than not, you know, you'll just be working with the controller configuration to, you know, set the preference at the more global level there. And then maybe on a 1 or 2 AP basis, you might override that with a static IP address. And remember, this only applies if the controller supports both v4, v6, and the AP supports v4, v6. If the controller only supports v4, well, it's a moot point. We can only join over v4. Same thing on the AP side. Once your AP joins, if you want to see, you know, did it join via v4 or v6? If you look at the AP list, you know, the AP list always shows the IP address of the AP. If it's a v4 address, it joined via v4. If it's a v6 address, it joined via v6. It's pretty much as simple as that. On the AP side, you could also look, okay, what controller did I join to? Is it an IPv4 or IPv6 address? You can see it on both sides, the controller and on the AP. Now, speaking of v6, I guess we'll sort of throw this in here because it doesn't quite fit elsewhere. When we use CAPWAP, you know, IPv6 to do CAPWAP, by default, our APs use a protocol called UDP Lite for CAPWAP communications. And it's sort of a subset, or it's based off of UDP, but it allows faster processing of the packets because normal UDP forces a checksum on the full payload of the packet. So, you know, it's not just the header, it's the entire packet itself, header plus payload. Whereas UDP Lite, we only need to process the checksum on the header portion and not on the full payload. And so it allows just for faster processing. And this is the default, it's turned on by default. So when your APs join up, they don't communicate via UDP, they communicate via UDP Lite, which actually uses a different protocol number, protocol 136, than UDP, which could be a little problem, you know, if for whatever reason there's a firewall between your AP and your controller, and you know, you tell them, you know, I want to use IPv6, and make sure that UDP port 5246 is open. Well, by default, it's not going to work because UDP is a different protocol than UDP Lite. You would need to tell them protocol 136 with, you know, port 5246 needs to be open. And so we can either turn this on globally, on or off globally, and the APs will normally follow in line, or we can do a per AP configuration of this. So we could, maybe have it on globally and turn it off on one AP or two APs or vice versa. But if you do change it, it does force the APs to disconnect and then reconnect. But they don't have to go through a full reboot. Okay, so let's look at the join preference first, and we'll follow it up with that UDP Lite configuration. So I have LAP5 just sort of waiting in the wings, getting ready to join up to my controller. Since all my APs have previously joined, they have been configured with preferences, but we can see it in a few different commands, but let's show you one that I've shown you before, show CAPWAP client config. It's down on the second page here. We see the prefer mode. So I've actually configured this one to prefer IPv6. So this will either say IPv4, IPv6, or it'll say unconfigured, but unconfigured means IPv4. All right, so when my LAP5, once I allow this to communicate to my controllers, it's going to try to join via v6, assuming it discovers both v4 and v6 addresses, which it will, because controller 2 has both configured, so does controller 3. And so what we should see is this. Right now, the controllers are at their default, so they're set to prefer v4. So my LAP5 will join via its preferred mode, v6. At the conclusion of its join, it will get overridden and changed to a v4. It'll disassociate, reassociate using v4, and there it will stay. So that's what the first example is going to be here. So I've statically set this, and the way I set it, CAPWAP, AP, prefer mode, IPv6. That's how I configured this on the AP. All right, so the way I've stopped this is I've actually shut down the WAN port, so I'm going to bring this up, and that should allow my AP to discover my controllers. And I'll just make controller 2, 10.0.4.12 the primary. Okay, so it looks like it is restarting. It's going to pull a new IP address, which will be perfect. So we're going to start a new discovery cycle. And at this point, we're going through the discovery mode. Let's see who it joins. Hopefully this config got in there fast enough. Okay, so here we see it attempting to join an IPv6 address, which is controller 2's IPv6 address. So it joined. It's going through the process. Okay, and then, sorry, and I missed it already. There was a close. So right after the join, there was a close. And now it's rejoining, same controller via IPv4. So if I scroll back up, if it lets me. Okay, so here was where we initially were building up the DTLS tunnel. We send a join to it. It joined. Immediately, it was closed. So it got the new config. The prefer mode was different. And so it closed. There was a bunch of other logs. Then it joined to the IPv4 address of the same controller, and here it stays. And if I do the show command, we should see that my prefer mode has changed, which it has, so now it's an IPv4 prefer mode. And if I look at controller 2, either in the GUI or the CLI, show AP summary, we see everything is joined up over v4. We see all our v4 addresses here. So now let's use a static IP address on LAP5 to override this preference, and then we'll show you where to change the preference on the controller. So on LAP5, let us, actually I want to do this through the controller. Anytime your APs are joined to a controller, you want to configure them through a controller. So I'm going to switch over to the GUI here. And this one is LAP5. I can tell by its IP address. Rename it for helpfulness. Okay, so let's set a static IP address. And I can put either a v4 or a v6 address. So if I put a v6 address, 2001 CC1E, what should its address be? 26::55, we'll say. I believe that should be the correct subnet. The mask is /64. And the default gateway should be Oops. Try this again. ::1. And let me just double check to make sure I'm putting the correct information here, because if you goof this up, things aren't going to work very well. Show IPv6 int VLAN 126. Okay, 2001 CC1E 26::1. Perfect. That's what I'm looking for. Make sure I have this right. Okay, I think I'm good. I'm going to hit apply. Now we'll see, my AP might even leave and come back here. And once I have that, I could also optionally add some DNS information. We don't really need to worry about that right now. But let's just watch our AP and see if it's doing anything. Okay, so it actually did close out its connection. What we should see now is that it's going to join via IPv6 and just stay up via IPv6. All right, so we're waiting for some logs to flush out. Haven't seen a join yet. Okay, it's actually moved over to controller 3, which is okay. But what we're going to see here is controller 3's prefer mode is IPv4 as well. But this time we joined and we didn't immediately disconnect, and we're going to stay up. So it didn't like, evidently it deemed that we couldn't stay on controller 2 anymore, and that's why it moved over to controller 3. But if we look at controller 3, show AP summary, we see we have a couple of APs here, and it divvies them up between V4 and V6, so we actually see a different category of V6 transport. And there's the V6 IP address of LAP5. If we looked at it in the GUI, they don't divvy it up that way, but we can still see the IP addresses there. And so here, the fact that I see an IPv6 address means that's what it's using for its CAPWAP transport. So there's a successful overriding of the controller's preferred mode by using a static IP address on the AP. Okay, what if we did want to change some of these preferred mode on the controllers? Where would we do that? Well, we have one of them for the global config, should just be under controller general, and here it is, CAPWAP prefer mode, IPv4 or IPv6. This is the global prefer mode. And we could do it on a per AP basis. I don't really, I'm not going to get into the AP groups, but I'll show you where it would be in an AP group. So I'll just create a dummy one real quick. All right, and we want, there we go. So by default, it's unconfigured, which means we use the global prefer mode. But we can check the box and override the global prefer mode on the per AP basis. So as long as the AP is in this AP group, and I check this box, okay, well these APs would prefer to use IPv6, even though every other AP that's not in this AP group would be preferring IPv4. So there's our options in terms of configuring the prefer mode on the controller. Last up was that UDP Lite configuration. And we're going to find that underneath wireless, global configuration. And here at least we can do the global setting. And we're going to find it down towards the bottom. So again, this is wireless, global configuration under access points. Scroll down. And here we do have it, UDP Lite. Turn it on, it's on by default. You can turn it off and this would, my LAP5 would have to disconnect and reconnect. I can't remember if I can do this on a per AP basis in the GUI. Let me just see real quick, and my AP's already left. It's probably moved back to controller 2. Which it has, and that's because controller 2 is set as its primary controller. So that's why we moved back here. And even though it's an IPv4 address for discovery, we still learn V4 and V6 addresses. Join is always a separate phase from discovery. So even though we use V4 methods for discovery, we can learn V6 addresses, and vice versa. We can use V6 methods for discovery and also learn V4 addresses. All right, so if I go into this, since this actually is using IPv6 now, let's see if we get any extra options for this. It's not under the IP config here. What about advanced? If not, we'll definitely show it. There it is, yep. So UDP Lite, we do have the checkbox in the GUI for this, but this checkbox, I believe, only is going to show up if it's an IPv6, using IPv6. So we could turn it on, turn it off here, whereas if I go into an AP that has IPv4 advanced, we see it's not there. So the only valid config once the AP is actually using v6 for its transport. But we can do it, again, sort of globally, and then we can do it on a per AP basis as well. Anytime you make the change, though, it's going to have to drop and reconnect to make the switch. And so there is how controlling your preference between v4, v6. You know, once I decide I want to join controller 2 and I have the option of v4, v6, this is how we can control which transport are we going to use.